Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Robert Cribb. I'm speaking to you from the Australian National University, or actually from my home, which is not far from the Australian National University in Canberra, which is located on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of the land in this part of Australia. Before we start, I just let you know that the presentation is being recorded. If you wish to say something that you don't wish to be recorded, please let me know and we can cease the recording briefly. Today's panel arises from a forthcoming special issue of the journal Itinerario with the title Coercing Mobilities, Territory and Displacement in the Politics of Southeast Asian Muslim Movements. Now, it seems to me that this special issue, which of course none of you have yet had a chance to read, but which will hit the bookshelves, or at least the electronic bookshelves very soon, it represents a new phase in the study of Islam in Southeast Asia. I can't comment at all on the broader study of Islam, which some of our speakers are much more expert than I am, but it seems to me as a Southeast Asianist that the study of Islam in the region has gone through three not distinct but relatively identifiable phases. The first one was one which grew out of colonial attitudes, and it was one in which being Muslim was seen as a kind of strange psychological condition, which was marked by stubborn adherence to narrow religious prescriptions and by a resistance to modernity. So in this view, which of course we can see in many parts of the world, many parts of the Western world, survives to this day, Islam is recognized as a major force, but as one which has to be managed in the way one would manage a wild animal or a child, needing special tactics and techniques, but not really being taken seriously as a partner or an interlocutor. There was a second phase which emerged. It was already present to some extent in the colonial period, but it became much stronger in the post-colonial period. And that was a recognition of the richness of Islam as a civilization, as a source of culture, and a source of intellectual traditions which motivated people all across the Muslim world of Southeast Asia. So this was an approach that emphasized the cosmopolitanism and civilization of Islam. It seems to me we're now entering a third phase in which the study of Islam has drawn in two other important elements in the study of Southeast Asia. One is the long-standing discomfort which Southeast Asianists have had with state frameworks, with the idea that you can understand Southeast Asia only in terms of the 10 ASEAN countries or the 10 plus Timor-Leste, discomfort with the borders that have been drawn to separate Southeast Asia from other regions. So that discomfort fits very well with the idea of Islamic cosmopolitanism in the as an approach. But it also draws on a more recent interest in the nature of geographic mobility, an interest in the way in which people move around the region and the terms on which they move. And one of the particularly important elements of this focus on mobility has been to juxtapose the contradiction between mobility as freedom, the idea that mobility means you can move anywhere, and forced mobility, the forcible movement of people from one region to another. We've known those things all the time, of course, but setting the fact of freedom against, or right next to the fact of coercion, has generated, I think, new insights into the way that mobility works. And this panel today, this special issue, I think marks an emerging era in the study of Islam in Southeast Asia, in which the religion is being taken still more seriously in its own right. And in a sense, we're almost getting to the point where we're inverting that first, that original view of being Muslim as a psychological condition, and instead treating being colonial as a strange psychological condition, in which there is an obsession with the narrow exercise of power, the narrow control of people, and a resistance to permitting religious practice, a resistance to permitting the free exercise of movement in the region. So that's the context in which I think this special issue has appeared. I'm now going to introduce our speakers. There are 5 authors in the special issue. 4 of them are here today. The 5th quailed at the difficulties of the time difference. Zoom doesn't overcome everything. So we have 4 speakers today. Francis Bradley, who is at the Pratt Institute in New York. He brings to us an intriguing combination of research on jazz and musical diasporas, and research interest in transnational Islamic revivalism. Then we have Joshua Gedacht from Rowan University in New Jersey. He teaches on the modern Middle East and Islam in Asia. His research focuses on Muslim networks and religious connections across Southeast Asia, going into the Indian Ocean world and across to the Middle East. And this will be the basis of a book which is well advanced, which has the intriguing provisional title, Coercive Cosmopolitanism. I think this counts as a euphoric couplet. It's an unexpected combination of 2 terms that we don't normally put together. Our 3rd speaker is David Kloos of the KITLV in the Netherlands, in Leiden. He's the author of Becoming Better Muslims, which focuses on Islamic practice in Aceh, and he now has a project looking at female Islamic leadership in Indonesia. Then our 5th speaker, Amrita Malhi, is affiliated with ANU, and she's engaged in a project that combines the big picture of Islamist globalism with the small, fascinating story of a rebellion in Terengganu in the early 20th century. Our final non-speaker is Kiara Formichi from Cornell University. Many of you will know her as the author of a great book on the Darul Islam and Kartos Wirjo, who led the most important rebel movement that has affected Indonesia since independence. But unfortunately, you can't see her because she is in a very, very different time zone. So before we hand over to our 4 speakers to say a little bit about the main points that they are going to bring to their, that come out of their papers, I'm going to ask Joshua and Amrita to say a little bit about the special issue. So over to you, Joshua.
Well, thank you very much to Robert and that kind introduction and agreeing to participate and help us have this valuable conversation. And thank you to ANU and Amrita. Thank you to David, going back to, I think it was 2016 that we originally had this workshop at KITLV. So without him, this would never have come to fruition. So, and of course, thanks to all the participants and for all of you listening. So basically, the title of our special issue is Coercing Mobility, Territory and Displacement in the Politics of Southeast Asian Muslim movements. And, you know, I'm going to just start off with talking about our conceptual contribution. You know, we do get a lot in the special intro into kind of, besides for talking about our works, engaging with the scholarship on Indian Ocean and connections, Islamic connections, and those things of those nature. We sort of try to engage with this by building off a few specific people who have worked on those issues, people like Anand Young, Carrie Ward, Ronit Ricci, and Michael Laffin, to really make an intervention in kinds of the literature on mobilities, to kind of try to problematize it, to try to kind of develop a critical history of mobilities, and just instead of looking at it as kind of a celebratory narrative, which sometimes we're moving away from in Indian Ocean, but sometimes in the past we veered a little bit in that direction. So we're trying to kind of build towards this critical history. And I think one specific contribution we want to look at is, instead of looking at mobility and territories, mobility and territorialization as kind of opposed forces, kind of as being things that are working in opposition to one another, that states are trying to contain or reverse mobility, and people are kind of getting there, are kind of acquiring freedom or more potential by crossing borders. We kind of want to look at how mobility and territorialization are linked. So kind of look at how they're mutually productive, both in kind of states and colonial empires using mobility to kind of try to create new spaces, new territories, and kind of define the boundaries and how those can be used. Alternatively, also looking at alternative ideas that don't go through the dominant post-colonial and post-colonial, but kind of looking at how Muslim actors can engage in their own mobilities, own movements to try to create alternative spaces. So I think Amrita will be elaborating on the space part, the territory part more, but that's kind of our first big contribution. Our second big contribution is to kind of, I think all of our papers look at one way or another at war, conflict, rebellion, and kind of armed violence. And I think that sort of gets omitted from a lot of this mobilities discourse. I mean, you do have works obviously that look at forced transportation, convict labor, things of that nature, so coercive element to some degree. And you do look at kind of soldiers in empires who might be Asians who are moving around, but still the fact that wars themselves, whether or not the invasion of Patani, or whether or not it's the Dutch Aceh War, or whether or not it's a Malayan emergency, these kind of all factor into this interplay of territorialization and mobility. So that's our second major contribution, or at least the three contributions I've had. Amrita is going to elaborate on some more. But the third one that I had also thought about was also specifically to the Muslim mobilities narratives and discourses. There's a lot of work on that, but it tends to be focused on Mecca and Istanbul kind of as centers, kind of, obviously Francis has done excellent work on that with Patani, and, you know, very important part of that story. But there are Muslim movements that are not just scholars, that are not just Hajis, but people who are going from Patani, not just to Mecca, but to Bangkok. There are people who are moving from Java, within Java, or into the borderlands of Malaysia and Thailand. And those are kind of still seen as Muslim networks by the actors involved and by colonial states who are trying to repress them. So trying to broaden these narratives about what mobility is. So Amrita, I'll turn it over. Those are kind of the three big contributions that I saw. I'll turn it over to Amrita. Build off of that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Josh. Look, thanks to everybody. Josh has already said all the thank yous, so I won't repeat them. But yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I guess, that there are, you know, a few things going on in the special issue that we wanted to pay specific attention to. One is just how much movement there has been around Southeast Asia. I mean, you know, once you kind of become aware of it, you can't stop seeing it. And if you've grown up as a kind of a school kid or a uni student, you know, looking at national histories, it can be pretty disruptive in the sense that, you know, you start to kind of just see how many refugees are being sort of pushed out of, you know, conflicts and even sometimes they're not armed conflicts. They can be quite, subtle, bureaucratic or geographic or epistemological conflicts, right? But people are pushed out as a result of all kinds of different contests, and they're just moving like crazy. So we wanted to pay attention to that, and not just in a way that foregrounds, your cosmopolitan jet set or, an elite class of movers. There's a lot of work in sociology that irritates me, I'll be honest, that is really about people deliberately choosing, because of a pre-existing cosmopolitan worldview, to engage in a kind of a mobile lifestyle. So you read a lot about these people. They're the digital natives, and they move around from place to place. And there's, I think, a too much emphasis on that sort of work. But luckily for us working in history, there has been a shift towards understanding that some of this mobility is just not free. Quite a good deal of it is not really free. I mean, there's a big question in terms of what is freedom, right? But, there are lots of examples where the initial push hasn't exactly been voluntary. And then we found in the articles that are in the special issue that sometimes people who are involuntarily moved, or, their mobility is coerced, they can really, lean in, to use a hideous phrase, they can lean into their displacement, and they can kind of use it as an opportunity to develop new ways of thinking politically about what kind of nation or region or even world that they want to live in. So we really wanted to focus on, connecting, I guess, the question of mobility with the issue of the structural factors that produce mobility. And that's where the territory bit comes in. Very often some of these, I guess, push factors in the modern, parlance are actually interventions by states, sometimes non-state actors, but often states, that essentially want to kind of remap territory in new ways. So the excellent example is David's article on Aceh, where there's a highly connected polity, I suppose, and a very cosmopolitan, well, it's certainly quite a global regional Indian Ocean outlook. And the Dutch come in and they deliberately sever every connection, and they deliberately reorient and remap Aceh in a way that it becomes essentially a problem backwater, full of violent people that need to be managed, etc., in the way that Robert mentioned, in terms of the colonial frame. So, there are some really important, I guess, examples of how a territorial intervention has actually produced the mobility that we're talking about. And so, it's important, I guess, that when we look at how political movements have been produced through history in Southeast Asia, that we recognize that sometimes those politics, whether it's at the micro level of individuals trying to find solutions for themselves, or at the kind of the mass or large scale sort of movement level, those politics are very often conditioned and shaped and influenced by the experience of coerced mobility. And if we don't recognize that in terms of Southeast Asian independence movements, in terms of actors that are carved out of the national story, for example, the 10th Regiment of the Malayan Communist Party, or also, Kartasewira in Kiara's example, sometimes people are excised from the national story, and they have to kind of be excised, physically as well as sort of discursively, right? And so, there are examples there of, I guess, of individuals and actors and movements coming up with some amazing, very interesting visions of how to change the world and what kind of world they think they want to build. It's just that they're not going to have an opportunity to do it. So they end up in, certainly in the 10th Regiment's case, developing a vision of the world that they cannot possibly produce, yet it is so creative and so inventive, right? So yeah, I guess just recognizing that mobility in the production of these politics has been, a key priority for us, and also how states, as Josh said, don't necessarily want to shut down mobility. Sometimes they want to produce mobility. There's a lot of migration that is produced by, quite active interventions. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
So would you like me to?
Hey, thanks very much.
Transitioning in? Yeah, sorry.
Yes. Francis, so over to you, please, for your account of what you've told us in the article.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thank you, Amrita, for organizing this, and thank you, Amrita and Josh, for both co-editing, and for David for organizing the original workshop. It was a wonderful workshop, and I feel this is a wonderful 5-year reunion that we're having here, and so maybe we'll have to plan something for 2026, every 5 years from here on out. Anyway, my paper, is a bit of sort of a speculative paper because partly I felt like I needed to make up for the fact in a way that I'd written an entire book about Patani and hardly spoken about women at all. And yet Patani is this sort of interesting place. It always seems to be pushed out as this kind of set forward as this kind of exception or this sort of peculiarity in that in the late 16th century, basically between 1584 and 1718, it was primarily ruled by female monarchs. In fact, 4 consecutive ones between 1584 and 1649. And Patani, and that, I mean, when we say that just like that, it may not seem that remarkable, but if we look through the stretches of human history, there's almost no place that's actually accomplished that. I mean, almost no European state has had 4 consecutive female rulers or governors of any kind, and in the Americas as well. So, Patani sort of stands out as this kind of interesting place. And not only that, but that during the period of female rule after 1584, that's also really where we see Islam begin to really rise and become a more central kind of part of, I think, day-to-day life among people, and partly through the patronage from the queens. So again, Patani, and of course Aceh being the other state that did it slightly later. Some people have speculated on the Patani model. So, that's all, of course, in the background of my paper. My paper focuses on the period after 1785 when Patani entered into 5 devastating and brutal wars against Siam, in which it went from being a kind of rebellious and, tributary state of a certain kind to being sort of forced into full subjugation and being provincialized, turned into what is now the 4 southern provinces of I guess what we call the deep south of Thailand. No other part of the country that I'm aware of is referred to as deep anything. So, sort of its otherness is inscribed in the language that is used to locate it. So, in 1785 was the most brutal of the wars, but there was an abortive uprising a few years later in 1789, led by some of the surviving refugees who had returned, and then again in 1808, 1831, and 1838. And all 5 of the wars essentially resulted in the same outcome, with Siam being the victor, and usually with a massacring of the elites and an enslavement of a chunk of the population. So, with all of that, I went to the British Library in 2008, and I came across the very first. I made my requests at the desk, and they brought me some of the texts. And the first one that came to me was this report by Sir Francis Light. And this is the very first sentence that I read, and it sent a chill down my spine when I read it. It said that this is from his report dated September 12th, 1786, where he's talking about the outcome of the very first of these wars. He said, the Siamese general is extirpating Patani. All the men, children, and old women he orders to be tied and thrown upon the grounds, and they're trampled to death by elephants. Now this, I assume, was somehow brought to him through probably some kind of contact with refugees that were arriving there, and around 1787 or 1786, 87, they were coming from the first of these wars, and he was there positioned kind of near Kedah, where they were coming. So my paper begins basically asking the question, what happened to Patani's young women? Because I found Light's language just very peculiar, and that he basically doesn't mention anything about young women at all. So what happened to them? And it's a speculative paper because the sources don't tell us as much as we would like. So I basically follow them through their mobilities, primarily through their experiences as refugees, and their experiences through enslavement, from what we can understand. These are incredibly sparse stories. In many cases, we see women kind of disappearing from the historical record with not a lot to be said. But so anyway, looking at refugees, and this is my first point. I tried to follow them because in my book, where I looked at the refugees that essentially went to Mecca in 1786 and 87. I tried to follow the same trajectory and look at what happened to women that went to Mecca. So, there's this sort of leads one to think about sort of how did women form communities? What were their social worlds like? And in a place where there had been a sustained period of sort of female rule, I sort of tried to think about, what positions of leadership were available or possible for women in this period of warfare and after the period of warfare. And one of the main points I make is that I think in a period where there was sort of a shift from a sense of this period of the queens where they've been integral to Islamic patronage of Islamic institutions, and then a shift towards an expectation that the rulers might themselves personally have sort of military prowess as a key feature of their sort of ability to rule. We don't see a single female ruler or a significant figure within the political establishment, throughout this entire period and onwards. So what does that tell us? There at least seems to be some sort of shifting notion of what people were looking for in their leaders, which didn't seem to favor women very well in the period of conflict and onwards. Now, so one of the main shifts in the 19th century in Patani, of course, was the rise of the leadership of the Ulama. Now, there were probably some Ulama that were in positions of leadership prior to these wars, but we don't have any record of them. We don't have any record at all, really, except that we know their most prominent sheikh. We know that his father was a sheikh and his grandfather was a sheikh, and we don't have much other evidence. So, but we do know that in this movement to Mecca, and in some cases in the movement down into what is now Malaysia, that women did have positions of leadership within Islamic circles of learning, primarily around the teaching of the Quran, the recitation of the Quran. And I find a number of references there to talk about women as prominent teachers of sometimes what was younger students' first kind of step towards sort of becoming more.
Francis, it might be time to wind up.
Sorry.
Yep.
So I look at that dynamic. I look at sexual violence, and the sexual violence question is the one that I think I had in my mind from that first kind of encounter with Light's report. Unfortunately, there's almost no evidence to really tell us much more, other than the fact that we know that the vast majority of people who were enslaved through the process were younger women. So, who were destined for, lives of concubinage in Bangkok and other places in central northern Thailand or whatever. So, so sexual violence seemed to be sort of institutionalized on some level, and we can't really know a whole lot more about that unless other sources kind of surface. So that's one of the other dynamics I look at in the paper. And then just kind of conclude with thinking about leadership and thinking about women's prominent, roles kind of in the markets and in kind of economically in Patani still today in a lot of ways, and in the ways that in which women who were refugees in places like Malaysia kind of integrated themselves into the communities there. So anyway, so I should wrap up and let others speak. So anyway, we can move on.
Okay, Francis, thanks very much. So I think we move now to Josh.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stan. So I'm moving on. I guess we have 2 papers on Aceh. So David will be following up. So we're moving on to the Aceh section of the presentation. So my paper is on Aceh and exile specifically. I think if you are not familiar with Southeast Asia, some of you in the audience might not be, but you know, Aceh is in northwestern Sumatra. And it's kind of in the Indonesia, it's kind of seen as kind of the example of a colonial war against Muslims, right? There's kind of a 3 to 4 decade war going from 1873 to the first or second decade of the 1900s, depending on periodization. You have kind of this narrative of holy war, Perang Sabil in Malay, kind of emanating from the local population. You kind of have this like Dutch interest in this as kind of the war that kind of went wrong to a large degree. Now, I kind of, in my paper, I was kind of, where I came to it was kind of, you know, towards the end of that war, towards some things that have been talked about less in the historiography of Aceh, and kind of looking at, I kind of came across at KITLV and the Dutch National Archives these series of documents about exile, and it got me to thinking about the fact that the Sultan of Aceh, Muhammad Daud Shah, is exiled at the end, and yet that never really figures very centrally, certainly in the English language historiography, and still I would probably say in the Dutch less. And that got me thinking about what role exile plays in colonial Indonesia in this unwinding this Muslim sultanate, so to speak. So just to give you a sense of my empirical paper, this kind of question of what's going to happen to the Sultan of Aceh, I kind of start off in the intro with that. And then I kind of engage with this kind of geographic anthropological theory that I came to about deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And I kind of say, you know, basically what it sounds like, there's a long history of the Dutch East Indies Company, other European companies parachuting, exiling people far from home, and using that as a means of both deterritorializing some people, but also consolidating their informal and sometimes direct control over kingdoms in Java elsewhere. But, you know, in Aceh, that kind of link between deterritorialization and reterritorialization kind of unravels a little bit, because at the very beginning of the war, the Dutch decree that the Sultanate is abolished, that there's no more Sultanate in Aceh. There's kind of no organization to work through legitimately. So, so that's kind of my argument. And therefore, towards the end of the war, once things start unsettling, there's a long period process, the Dutch kind of start experimenting with moving people around. And it's not moving people to Sri Lanka. It's not necessarily moving people to faraway places, but it's kind of moving the Ule Bawang, the kind of customary elites of Aceh, kind of sending them to Java, to West Java, to Bandung, to kind of either go to colonial schools, to native training institutes, or because they're basically being punished for going there. Sometimes the punished and the educated, the people who are going to school, are the same people. Like they kind of come in and go to school after kind of being sent away for some crime that they've, the Dutch have accused them for committing. Sometimes they worry about good students being, you know, so there's kind of these combined logics. And what I say in my argument about the contribution, besides for kind of telling this story that I don't think has really been told about Acehnese history, is that this kind of shows that mobility is attempting to be used by the colonial states to produce space, moving people within colonial spaces to Java to kind of take what was an old Sultanate center, kind of peripheralize it by kind of educating a new Ule Bawang class through education and exile. And this is really just the more formal realization. I mean, exile has always had an educative pedagogic element by kind of telling people, don't cross the colonial state, otherwise we'll send you home far away. But now it's literally often intersecting in classrooms. So that's kind of what I look at. In the next paper, part of the paper, though, I get into debates about the Sultan. When he's caught in 1903, they decide that they're going to keep him for 4 years. So there's they want to keep him. They kind of have this elaborate, choreographed, behind a big image of Queen Wilhelmina, his submission, and they keep him in Aceh, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And that's kind of where I get into how the Dutch scheme is not necessarily always perfectly realized or controlled. So there's a lot of narratives, particularly about the Sultan interacting with people from Penang, from across the Strait settlement. Indian diasporic figures are mentioned a couple of times, and the Dutch are getting really anxious about this. And basically 4 years later, they basically have enough. And they kind of decided they're going to actually send him much farther from home, to Eastern Indonesia, to Ambon. And I kind of use that as a sense of, these networks are something the Dutch are trying to control, but they realize and they're anxious about the fact that they can't. There's still all sorts of mobilities that they're not managing. And indeed, the Sultan is going to stay in contact, even as he's sent to Eastern Indonesia. And the memory of that Sultan is going to continue to grow, such that in the 1930s, you have kind of a movement to restore the Sultanate. So kind of my argument is about both the Dutch schemes to kind of use mobility to get rid of an old Sultanate space and to produce a new colonial space to peripheralize Aceh, but of the limitations and inability to use that. And I think, so those are kind of the contributions. So, the contribution specifically to Aceh's history is telling more about the story of the exile of the Sultan and kind of moving these customary elites to educational schools, and kind of trying to show that exile still is really something that's in the colonial toolkit, like not just to put communists in jail, or to, or for convict labor, but it's still something that in creating this state in the early 20th century, exile is still very much something that's being centered by the colonial state. So that's one thing that I'm trying to talk about. And kind of just trying to see how space evolves from kind of the old, from the world of sultanates in the past to kind of spaces. So I think I'll wrap it up there. I think that was close to 10 minutes and we're at 6:40. So I'll let David, he's the next presenter on Aceh. So I'll give it over to him.
Thanks a lot, Josh, and thanks Amrita, and thanks a lot, Robert. Well, you said a lot about Aceh, so that's easy. I can just skip a lot of the kind of the introduction and kind of move straight on with my contribution, which is an article about the Dutch-Achenese War and the discourses that emerged in its wake. And the Achenese are Muslims, but as Josh also said, Islam is a very complex place. So meaning in that war, both the Dutch and some Achenese fighters increasingly framed the war as a religious struggle, with the emphasis here on framed. And I guess that's partly what the article talks about. So compared to the other articles in the special issue, my article focuses somewhat less on the actual mobilities of people and more on the spatial orders that serve to manipulate that mobility. Actions, particularly on the part of the colonizers, to reconfigure space and the relationships between specific places. In this case, in the case of my article, the Achenese West Coast, Banda Aceh, Batavia, kind of compared to a game of football, where I'm kind of less interested in how people are moving or made to move, but how the pitch is being changed, and how the lines are being changed, and how it encourages certain routes and how it cuts off others. People in Aceh responded in different ways to these reconfigurations, often pragmatic, often opportunistic, sometimes desperately. And what is interesting about the Dutch way of managing the condition of the Achenese, here I'm just using Robert's words, is how they increasingly came to emphasize religion. Again, as Robert said, as a major force, yet also as a major problem that had to be managed, had to be domesticated, had to be limited, had to be enlightened if possible, and so forth. it keeps striking me as remarkable that a region that has received so much attention by historians has remained to be understood in such binary terms. This is really what motivates the article and kind of my work on Aceh more generally. Colonial versus anti-colonials, Achenese versus Indonesians, fanatical versus moderate Muslims. And I've tried to challenge those binaries historically, starting with the very basic question of how essentialist narratives about the Achenese as devout, as rebellions came into being in the first place. The title of the article is, what is the title of the article? I should say it right, is this/connection, violence, religion and geographic imaginings in Aceh and colonial Indonesia, 1890s, 1920s. 1890s, 1920s here is not so much kind of an overview of that period, but rather two reference points. Two concrete episodes in this 80-year-old long war, because I don't think it really ever ended, to show how resistance and anti-colonial violence came to be understood by the Dutch over time as fundamentally religious in nature, superseding other less ideological or other kinds of ideological motivations for resistance. And I'll just try to be brief here and not go into those cases in detail. But very briefly, it is one case of a struggle for a town on the West Coast, which was a very ambiguous conflict where resistance kind of went over to the Raja, who was loyal to the Dutch, but he couldn't be trusted at all. The Dutch, in the meantime, talked about the resistance in terms of gangs as malicious elements. It was all very ambitious. And then the second episode, 1920s, when we see a flaring up of violence on the same, in the same region, the same West Coast, we see a fully fledged colonial discourse about the people of the Achenese West Coast as, people who've been in isolation for a long time, where mystical millenarian tradition has long been in place, and that has a kind of natural attraction to the holy war. And here the resistance is being, now resistance is being fully identified as religiously motivated. Again, to kind of come back to Robert's words, the psychological condition becomes very manifest here all of a sudden, which is a process. So the mutual interest of colonialists and certain religious leaders in framing the anti-colonial struggle as religious was embedded in a certain political geography. The West Coast is a place where the Dutch-Achenese violence kept flaring up, or the war kept flaring up. And that part of the story is steeped in stereotypes about the West Coast as a particular wild and dangerous place. And basically, I was curious what would happen if I would write about the Dutch-Achenese war from the perspective of that troublesome coast. Conceptually, that brought me to Willem van Schendel's argument about modern area studies producing geographies of knowledge and geographies of ignorance. On the Achenese West Coast, the colonial encounter produced a geography of knowing that served the colonial project by defining it as a frontier that had to be pacified and then connected physically through roads and infrastructure, administratively, through institutional hierarchies, and mentally, come back to the psychological condition again, through the bringing of progress, connecting West Aceh in that way to the Netherlands Indies. And in this process, the West Coast became a periphery in the newly formed province of Aceh, like the newly formed province of Aceh became a periphery in the Netherlands Indies. But closely tied to this project was a geography of ignorance that deliberately obscured a history of movement, of trade, of religious renewal, of transoceanic connection, where the West Coast of Aceh had for a long time been kind of central in all kinds of movements connecting Aceh to the Malay Peninsula, to the broader Indic Muslim world. Final point, The discourse of violence as being religiously motivated in combination with this particular geography of ignorance hides from view particular actors. We might call them political adventurers, opportunistic figures who were not really part of the upper layers of the indigenous elites in which Dutch colonialism was essentially based, but who for varying reasons, and that could be personal background, charisma, entrepreneurial savviness, religious leadership, a combination of those traits attracted a following and made a fuss. Historically, the Achenese West Coast was a very good place to make a fuss, to start a career as a local warlord, as an entrepreneur, as an aspiring nobleman, as a religious leader, as a trickster, as a combination of those things. In the context of a colonial war and the promises of that war, in terms of local resources being up for grabs, violence was always an option. The quintessential Achenese adventurer was Tuku Umar, but he still sits, this is kind of for those who know something of this history, I guess, but he still sits awkwardly in histories of the war, and that says a lot. They didn't do much, these kind of political adventurers, these aspiring warlords, they didn't do much work for the discourses that supported empire, but they didn't do much work for post-colonial nationalist histories either. And they've been faded out of the story, and we need them back. That's where I'll end.
Okay, thanks very much, David. I think now over to you, Amrita.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Look, I'll just cut to the chase. My article's rewriting the Malayan emergency of 1948 to 60 as a racialized enclosure of the Malayan interior. And the reason I have done this is, well, I mean, a couple of things. I was thinking about a number of things. So one is, there's been all this kind of political change in Malaysia over the last couple of years, and there's always, suggestions for reform that always seem to kind of collapse in a heap of people asking each other, why can't Malaysians move on from race? Why is every idea blocked by the use of race? Why is every kind of reform proposal shut down by a racial campaign? So that's been on my mind. On top of that, I wanted to kind of get a new project going. It was time to move on it. And it was basically on the Malayan emergency. It's on the 10th Regiment of the Malayan National Liberation Army, which was an armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party. And the reason the 10th Regiment is so interesting and unique is that it's an entirely Malay Muslim regiment of a party that is usually written in history as entirely Chinese or Chinese Malayan anyway. And the fact that these people were kind of transgressive in a kind of a Cold War environment in which Muslims are supposed to be anti-communist and the communists are all supposed to be Chinese, that already puts them in a very interesting position, to start with. And so essentially, I guess I connect the question of, what these people were up to and what experience they went through in the emergency, connect it with questions of, why is Malaysian society organized in terms of race? And the answer is essentially, whatever else the emergency might have done, and it did a lot of things, it also established a transition to independence, to a post-colonial, Malaysia, that was organized in terms of race. And it did this by ensuring, in part, that the Malayan interior was a kind of a Malay space. And part of how it did that was essentially by clearing out all the Chinese. And for it to be doing that through a process of, putting people in new villages or, deporting 20,000 of them to China, for them to be doing that and for these Muslims to be communists in the middle of all of that is a major, it's a hugely transgressive kind of politics that they're engaging in. So essentially, the 10th Regiment is formed in 1949. The emergency was declared in 48. So, the very next year, a whole lot of members of the Malay left had gone underground. Many had gone off to do other things. Others had, joined UMNO, joined other parties, done whatever they needed to do to continue operating. But a bunch of them, led by a guy called Abdullah CD, decided no, they were going to go underground, they were going to join the armed struggle, and they formed the 10th Regiment in 1949. By 1954, they'd already been kind of cleared off the map of Malaya, like they had been pushed up into the Thai borderland, and they were effectively in exile then for the rest of their lives. And Abdullah CD is still alive, he's 98, and he's been living in southern Thailand ever since. And he's not going to be able to come back. So you know, in a way, it's a story of how the idea that you can have a Malay left, the idea that you can have a non-UMNO Malay politics was effectively wiped off the map. So, you know, I talk about, I guess, how, you know, through a process of kind of racialized reorganization of society again and again and again through the Second World War and through the emergency and to the transition to independence, how these people are essentially pushed out and how then, as early as about 1955, they start to produce this incredible archive of materials in which they start to imagine a different kind of world in which it's possible for Muslims to be communists, because by the time of, you know, the kind of the high Cold War period, it's not possible for Muslims to be communists anymore. And now in Malaysia, if you're a Muslim and you're kind of pro-Chinese or you're on the left or whatever, these things are kind of conflated very quickly, and you end up kind of, you know, pushed into a political corner because of that. So it's about the production of that political corner that the, you know, the article wants to kind of address quite directly. So essentially, you know, by 1955, all their hopes are dashed. But they're producing, the 10th Regiment, I mean, they're producing, you know, periodicals, like I mentioned in the article. There's one in particular called Tauladan, in which, you know, there are stories of the exact kind of subject that they wish could occupy Malaya, you know, that could be the kind of political subject of an independent Malaya. And that is a kind of a completely bicultural subject who is perfectly comfortable with the fact that they are both communist and Muslim. Or they might be kind of comfortable with being Chinese and operating in a Malay milieu. So there's a really great article in one of these copies of Tauladan in which, you know, the 10th Regiment, they talk about this character, fictional or true, I don't know, called Atai, who's also known as Hassan, because he's so good at speaking to Malays. So he's a Chinese guy, he's operating, you know, in the Pahang interior, and he's going from village to village, organizing Malay people to kind of join the communist struggle. And in the process, he becomes kind of loved by Malays, and he's given a Muslim name, is named Hassan, or a Malay name, and he's able to, I guess, command the admiration of Chinese and Malays. So this is the kind of, you know, person that the 10th Regiment is imagining should live in Malaya. And it's sometimes the kind of person that, you know, reform-oriented donors wish could live in Malaysia today, but does not live in Malaysia today because of the political environment and the structure of the state and the way society is organized, which is entirely racial. And so I guess the article argues that race, in a way, was used as a technique. It was a technique of destabilizing, you know, who could identify with what sort of politics, and restabilizing it in terms of a very clear racial divide in terms of who could be a communist and who could not, and who was Chinese and who was not. So, you know, if politics is organized racially, if the state is going to be organized racially, then, you know, it's not enough to blame, I guess, Malay elites. It's not enough to blame, I suppose, you know, Islamists or UMNO or BAS, you know, whatever. You know, these actors kind of come as part of the fact of that reorganization of society. So there's something deeply structural, something territorial, and also something discursive there, where, you know, the two things are kind of, they're done at once, you know, where people are literally pushed out of the geo-body, right? So not just off the map, not just off the territory, but out of that kind of the way that the nation is imagined, which pushes them out of the bounds of political acceptability. So there they are in exile, producing these amazing visions, and they've got no prospect at all. Because it is simply not possible and has never been possible for that kind of subject to exist in Malaya, Malaysia. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amrita. Thanks very much to all four speakers. I think normally under these circumstances, the audience is also keen to start asking questions. I'll make it just a few comments, but I'll then open it to the floor, and in the course of answering questions from the floor, our speakers might be able to respond to some of my comments as well. First thing I just wanted to mention was the idea of selective permeability. And it seems to me that we're dealing with a circumstance in which some people are forced to move, some people are permitted to move. Some people are very explicitly not permitted to move. The barriers are set up to prevent them from moving. And so I think it'd be useful to have a consideration of the relative importance of the state, the colonial state and the post-colonial states, of class. Class is something that enables some people to move or makes them movement fodder, and culture, the extent to which people actually like the idea of moving or feel restless, or alternatively don't feel restless. I had a very small comment for David. I was struck by his highly Foucauldian suggestion that it was a form of punishment to be sent to school. And it's not a point to be developed further, but I thought I was amused by that.
I think that's Joshua, yeah.
Oh, sorry, it was Josh, yes, sorry. Yes. There's a broader point that struck me is the tension between, the tension over the consequences of mobility for modernity. And it seems to me there are two rival discourses that showed their heads at various times. One is that mobility is intensely modernizing. It's something that takes people away from their traditional environments, puts them in a new world, and therefore encourages them to adapt to that new world. So it's an intensely modernizing phenomenon. And you can see that in some of the discourses about Australia as a modern society in comparison with Britain, Siberia as a modern society in comparison with metropolitan Russia. On the other hand, there's also a very strong discourse that suggests that mobility, that people who are mobile carry with them whatever the social values might be of the time and place that they leave, and they fossilize them. So in that respect, mobility is a highly conservative phenomenon. And those are two plausible analyses of mobility, but they seem to me to be fundamentally at odds. And of course, they probably both work, but working out how they interact is likely to be important. And then the third thing that struck me was the tension between geographical and ethnic essentialization, the idea that some regions have a particular character. And this time it really was David talking about the changing perceived character of the west coast of Aceh, from being a cosmopolitan region to being a backwater. And we can see that kind of transformation of regions. Francis also introduced it as an issue. Patani having been a centre in its own right to being something that was marginalised. So the way in which the essentialisation of regions change, but then the way in which national identities are also, rather ethnic identities are also essentialized, so that people moving from one region to another carry with them that essentialized region, that essentialized regional identity. Okay, so we've reached 10 o'clock. Officially, this is when we're supposed to stop, and some people have had to leave, but I would like to open it now to the audience to ask questions before asking our four speakers to respond. So you can wave your hand if you're visible, or you can use the reactions button to click raise hand. And if you have just been sitting back enjoying the glittering performance of our four speakers, then we might simply go to them and ask them for their responses.
In what order?
Okay.
Just want to, yeah.
Well, let's go in reverse order.
Sure.
So we'll start with Amrita and then move back in the direction of Francis.
Yeah, okay, my goodness. Look, I've got a couple of things. One is, Robert, in the introduction you mentioned this kind of desire in the articles in the special issue, you know, on the part of all of us to take the fact that these people are Muslims seriously. So rather than kind of, you know, put it down to some kind of strange psychological condition or some kind of problem to be managed, actually just take it seriously. So it was important to me in the article to make sure that I took seriously that people in the 10th Regiment were proper Muslims. I mean, they were determined to be proper Muslims. They thought of themselves as proper Muslims. They were forever trying to grapple with issues of, you know, is it possible to be a communist and a Muslim at the same time, given the Cold War environment that they were in? And they even like wrote pamphlets and things on this question. So there's a pamphlet that basically says, yes, it is possible for atheists and Muslims to work together in the context of the national liberation struggle. And they go through it, you know, in quite some detail in terms of, you know, what makes it okay to join the struggle. And you know, it's going to sound, you know, pretty bad today, but they talk about how there are all these ethnic groups in China. Some of them are Muslim. They all participate in the revolution. I mean, in this climate where, you know, we talk about Uyghurs being put in camps, it doesn't sound right. Like it, but at the same time, we don't want to be anachronistic about it. These people are actually looking at diversity of ethnicity and religion in kind of revolutionary environments and saying, yes, it is possible for, you know, humans, people to reconcile these different questions. I mean, whether they had it right or wrong is not quite the point. The point is they were trying to deal with their own environment by looking at these external questions. And so the fact that they were kind of answering Malayan questions by drawing on external examples, which they might have been getting completely wrong, it's not quite the point. The point is they were trying to intervene in a kind of a specific Cold War context, which was Malaya. And the fact that they are doing that, you know, as Muslims has been kind of quite important in the article. So that's just one quick thing. And then the other thing about whether people actually like moving, you know, here's an example of some people that didn't want to move. They wanted to be leading the national struggle. They wanted to be leading the transition to independence. And they, you know, were really mad and upset and nostalgic about the fact that they couldn't. And you can see that anger and that disappointment in their writing. So no, they didn't want to be cosmopolitans, but they were forced to be. They were forced to kind of transition from being nationalists in context into being cosmopolitans in exile. And they treated that kind of quite seriously. So, you know, this idea then of, okay, well, we've been displaced, you might as well lean into it. That's pretty much what they tried to do. And of course it went nowhere, but it still shaped the nation that they were pushed out of, in the sense that it remains politically very useful to say to people, if you've got multiracial politics, you must be pro-Chinese and you must be a communist. It works, it's always said. And it's just part of their legacy, I guess, or the legacy that they failed to change.
Okay, thanks, Amrita. David, you're mute.
I'm still thinking about your intriguing comments and questions. The class question is, well, at least kind of for my analysis, hugely important. So the final point I made about the kind of the actors, those political adventurers, we can't understand their motivations if we don't look at class. And but where I think you said something like, you know, class allows mobility. I think here what I was getting at is class mobility. So now it's getting confusing. Class mobility. Encouraging real mobility, so kind of getting into that history in a little bit more detail, we see the West Coast is kind of a place where pepper gardens are being opened and becoming important, and where a certain kind of lesser nobility moves, who have the resources to kind of start entrepreneuring there, but who are not obviously the first sons, or, you know, kind of have the bigger landholders. Now, colonialism kind of really speeded that process up, in the sense that it made the richer layer, or the upper layer of the nobility even more, you know, richer. They basically become colonial officials. They got salaries and so forth. And then there was the losers. You know, there were still nobility, but they were the losers, and they went into the kind of looking for all the options that were there, and that could be, you know, amassing a following, or it could be kind of economic opportunities that they would find, you know, in those places where people were moving to. So kind of class mobility is a major factor, but it disappears from view because of that kind of thick colonial discourse that kind of looks at all kinds of other factors and motivations for during that period. And then the second, it's very interesting, you know, those two rival discourses to think about. So obviously the first discourse of mobility being tied to modernity was crucial in the way in which the Dutch sought to recontribute Aceh and reconnect the West Coast in a certain way so that it would also modernize. And the assumption there was obviously that the kind of modernity that had been brought to the North Coast would ultimately sort of also reach other areas. That's kind of the narrative. Whether then there was also a kind of fear, which would say makes sense, that those dangerous millenarian fanatics would then also kind of move into other spaces is a good question, and might be worth to kind of look into a bit more. I haven't got a good answer now.
Okay, well, thanks very much, David. Josh.
Hey, thank you. That was very thought-provoking comments, and I found it really excellent for forming my thoughts. And I really like the term selective permeability. I wish we had come up with that. I think that captures the some people are forced to move, some people want to move, some people are forced to stay, and this is all going on simultaneously. So that's what we're trying to capture with the introduction. I mean, I think in terms of class, that's a very important point. And, you know, there could be a follow-up paper or research at some point where I could envision. Obviously, in my case, I was looking at mainly the Achenese elite, the Sultan and various Ulai Balang. But, you know, there actually are obviously a lot of people coming from other parts of Indonesia into Aceh to serve in the military from Ambon, probably not from the elite ranks. So it would be a kind of nice counterpoint to see, you know, the moving in directions of, you know, some people moving this direction, other people moving that direction, and kind of recreating Indonesia or the Netherlands East Indies through these different class and different movements that you see. So I think that's important. I think this tension between mobility as modernity, I mean, you see that in one case study that I looked at. It was an Achenese hikayat that was translated and published in Dutch in the Indisches about Bentura Muda. And you kind of have this whole narrative in that translation for Dutch audiences about like, oh, the scary boat trip, and, you know, the waves were crashing and we thought we were going to die. But then they kind of get to Java and they kind of talk about just the diverse multitudes, like Chinese, Indians, other groups. They talk about the moving screen image and kind of the awe and wonder. So there is kind of this narrative of kind of like that they're kind of helping to educate and bring modernity. That's certainly what the Dutch are trying to promote. Whether or not, you know, that's exactly what happens, I would say is more problematic, but that's an important part of it. And then the last point I wanted to think was going back to your racial and ethnic, comment is that, you know, you see the Dutch are consciously trying to prioritize, like they talk about one person, they're going to send him to school in Java, and he can be the Ulai Balang instead of the person who was off in Mecca doing something else. So they're like, if you go to this school, we can kind of, so they're trying to privilege certain mobilities to kind of create Aceh as an ethnicity and a region within Netherlands East Indies space, and kind of trying to sever those connections with Mecca and the Indian Ocean. So you can kind of see, you know, this creation of both mobility and ethnicity, but of course that's integrally tied with people moving outside of what's supposed to be the ethnic or regional homeland. So yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you. Francis.
Yeah, thank you all for your comments, and Robert, thank you for moderating this. This has been great. Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, in some ways, my paper was sort of the odd one out in that I'm not really dealing with colonialism in the same way that the other papers are. Though, Siam was obviously an imperial state of a certain kind. And I'm not really dealing with modernity in the same way either. But I am dealing very much with mobility in my paper. And I think, I think, and this is something I think a point I made really actually more in my book than I did in this article, and that is that, the mobility that occurred kind of as a result, especially of the 1785 invasion by Siam into Patani, it kind of, I mean, it first of all, it sent thousands of refugees into northern parts of what is now Malaysia, and some of them went all the way to Mecca. And in a way, I feel like it created a different kind of Islamic world for that region, and it connected at least that part of Southeast Asia with the Middle East in a different way. And it was bridged by Southeast Asian Muslims largely themselves. And I think this is, I guess we would say, this is not really, we're not really dealing with modernity yet in a way, but this is what sparks the creation of an Islamic textual tradition, basically on a wide scale in the Malay Peninsula. That's a massive thing, and it sort of changed how Islam was practiced. So certainly, I think the mobility of going to the Middle East and industriously copying literally probably thousands of Islamic manuscripts and bringing those back, and then founding schools, which is, and it's a little bit beyond the scope of this paper, but it's more in my book. I think, I think the thing there is that, they were creating a certain kind of vernacular without the printing press. It's, to me, I think something that I haven't really thought completely through, but the fact that they were able to do it and found and basically come up with the Pondok school model, which may or may not really have existed, certainly didn't exist on a wide scale before Patani created the model, and then spread Islamic texts, not just in Patani, but all across the Malay Peninsula. To me, especially in the northern part of the peninsula, so I think, that I think is something that's kind of interesting, and I think the repercussions of it I haven't really kind of fully explored. In terms of just two other points I just wanted to make. I think one, I guess, is something that I've thought about in this paper a bit. I don't think I fully fleshed it out, but that is the sort of thinking about enslavement as mobility, at least initially, and then it's a sort of lack of a mobility, sort of an initial mobility leads to a lack of mobility. And something that I guess I was sort of thinking about was kind of how to challenge some of our sort of accepted, I think, wisdom on how Southeast Asian warfare was practiced. I mean, I think one of the points I was trying to make here is just that how women were the primary targets of enslavement. So, what does that tell us? And not that all of them were destined for concubinage. I didn't want to, I know I boiled it down earlier. Clearly some were, ended up in other capacities, but to sort of maybe rethink a little bit of the great Anthony Reid's that kind of low casualty thesis, and think about how violence was maintained after warfare through the enslavement of female slaves. So that's a sort of another point that I go into a little bit. I think I take a step or two into that with this paper, but I just want to kind of follow up on that. The other thing that came up was your discussion of the center, sort of thinking about the essentialization of centers. And to me, the interesting thing about Patani is that, I mean, there are many things that are interesting, but one of the interesting things is that to become an Islamic center, I guess I would argue that it almost had to, I'm not sure it would have become almost certainly would not have become the Islamic center that it became without it initially going through this incredibly traumatic period of having its elites massacred, its political system dismembered, and huge numbers of people enslaved. And if you asked, I mean, one of the things I don't know how this has been received in Patani itself, but if you asked, when I was there, you know, I would talk to people about the history. They would say, well, we were a great Islamic center, then we were conquered, and then, you know, here we are. And sort of been like this sort of thesis of decline. But I would say, as Patani had its political center was destroyed, it became an Islamic center, and it was only after that that it really reached its great heights as an Islamic center, to the point where, you know, many, you know, ambitious students in what is now Malaysia and the other sort of states there, Kedah, Terengganu, Kelantan, and so forth, they would go to Patani to study, right? So it became this kind of revered center that I think it maintained, you know, well into the, you know, mid to late 20th century. So, you know, the center of what? I think Patani did have this period where it became, you know, as much as it was politically kind of dismembered and subjugated, it became something else, which is rather remarkable, really, given the devastation that it experienced, that it was able to kind of reformulate itself and kind of go through, I think, kind of a massive change in how people thought of themselves, which I think had an eye towards modernity ultimately, I suppose.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Francis, and thanks very much to all four of our speakers. I'm very sorry that we didn't have Kiara as well, but might be just as well, since we've already gone 20 minutes over time. So thank you all for attending. Amrita, do you have anything that you would like to say at the end before we close?
The main thing is to say thanks to you for hosting, because you've been an excellent and gracious host, and you've kept us all in order. So thanks heaps, Robert.
Good. Okay, well, thank you all, and see you next time.